The Empire had ruled their part of the galaxy for 12,000 years. They were massive creatures that stood 9 feet tall with natural bone armor covering their bodies. Their claws carried poison that could kill most species in minutes. Their eyes could see heat signatures in complete darkness. Every world they had visited had fallen to their power. Every species they had met had either kneeled or died. They believed they were the ultimate hunters in the universe, and no evidence had ever suggested otherwise. Commander stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the stars pass by on the viewing screen. He was old by standards, with scars covering his armored hide from 100 different battles. He had personally led the conquest of 6 worlds and had never known defeat. His fleet of 30 warships moved through space like predators swimming through dark water. They were heading toward a small blue planet on the edge of the galaxy that their scouts had discovered several cycles ago. The scout report had been almost boring to read. The dominant species on this world called themselves humans. They were soft creatures with no natural armor and no claws. They had weak muscles compared to warriors, and their senses were dull and limited. Their only advantage seemed to be their numbers and their primitive technology. They had nuclear weapons and basic space travel, but nothing that could challenge superiority. The scout had recommended standard subjugation protocol. Had agreed without much thought. This would be an easy conquest. The fleet entered the solar system and ordered the communication officers to broadcast the standard ultimatum. The message was simple and had been used on dozens of worlds before. Surrender within 72 hours or face complete destruction. Submit to rule and your species will be allowed to serve. Resist and you will be erased from existence. The message was transmitted in every language the humans used. Expected the usual response. Fear followed by desperate negotiation followed by submission. On Earth, the message arrived during a routine morning for most of the planet. Within hours, the entire world knew that aliens existed and that they were demanding surrender. Panic spread through some cities, while others fell into shocked silence. Governments that had been rivals for generations suddenly found themselves facing a common enemy. Emergency meetings were called in every capital. Military forces were placed on highest alert. Scientists worked frantically to analyze the alien transmission and learn what they could about their enemy. In Geneva, the Unified Human Defense Council gathered in a secure underground bunker. Representatives from every major nation sat around a long table, while military leaders presented what little information they had. Admiral Lisa Monroe led the discussion. She was a tall woman in her 50s with gray hair cut short and eyes that had seen combat in 3 different conflicts. She had spent her career preparing for threats, and now the greatest threat in human history had arrived. Colonel Dan Harper sat beside her with tactical maps spread across his section of the table. He was younger than Monroe, with a reputation for creative thinking and a refusal to accept impossible situations. He had already begun sketching out defensive positions and counterattack strategies, even though the enemy had not yet arrived. Doctor represented the scientific community. She had been studying the alien transmission since it first arrived and had learned troubling things about them. Their technology was centuries ahead of human capabilities. Their ships were faster and better armed. Their soldiers were physically superior in almost every way. By any logical measure, humanity had no chance of winning a direct confrontation. The debate lasted for hours. Some voices called for negotiation. Perhaps that could be reasoned with. Perhaps surrender would not be as terrible as resistance. Others argued for immediate attack while the enemy fleet was still far from Earth. Strike first and strike hard before they knew what hit them, but most of the council sat in heavy silence as they considered the weight of the decision before them. Admiral Monroe listened to every argument and then stood to address the room. She spoke quietly, but her words carried to every corner. She said that humanity had faced extinction before. Ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions. Every time the species had survived because some people refused to give up. She said that surrender might save lives in the short term, but it would end everything that made humanity worth saving: freedom and hope and the chance to determine their own future. She said that she would rather die fighting than live as a slave to creatures who saw humans as nothing more than prey. The vote was unanimous. Humanity would not surrender. Colonel Harper immediately began coordinating the defense. Every military force on Earth was unified under a single command structure. Factories that had been producing cars and phones were converted to build weapons and ships. Scientists shared their research openly across all borders. Old enemies became allies overnight. The entire planet transformed into a fortress preparing for siege. In orbit, the few human space stations were reinforced and armed. Mining ships were converted into crude warships. Pilots trained in simulators for combat they had never imagined. Everyone knew the odds were against them, but something strange happened as the deadline approached. Instead of despair, a fierce determination spread through the population. People who had never held weapons volunteered for service. Communities organized supply networks and evacuation plans. Parents told their children stories about human courage and survival. Commander received reports that the humans had rejected his ultimatum. He was not surprised. Many species showed defiance before they understood power. He ordered his fleet to continue toward Earth at standard speed. There was no need to hurry. The outcome was already certain. These soft creatures would learn their place soon enough. His second officer asked if they should expect significant resistance, made a sound that served as laughter among his people. He said that resistance required hope and hope required some chance of victory. The humans had neither. They were prey pretending to be predators. When they arrived, they would demonstrate the difference between the two. The fleet crossed the orbit of the outer planets. Earth grew larger on their screens. Watched it with the calm patience of a hunter who had cornered his prey. He had done this many times before, and it always ended the same way. The prey would struggle and then the prey would fall. That was the natural order of things. That was the way of the universe. He did not know that he was about to learn how wrong he was. The fleet emerged from behind the moon and began its approach toward Earth. Commander stood at his command post and watched the blue planet fill his viewing screen. His tactical officers reported that human ships were gathering in a defensive formation near the planet. The numbers were laughable. 47 human vessels against 30 warships. The humans had courage, but courage meant nothing against superior firepower. Ordered his fleet to advance in standard attack formation. The ships moved forward like a wave of death, their weapons charged and their shields activated. Victory was moments away. Then the first human ship exploded. Watched with confusion as a small human cruiser deliberately flew into the path of his lead destroyer. The human vessel was already damaged and leaking atmosphere, but instead of retreating, it accelerated directly toward the ship. The explosion tore through both vessels and left nothing but burning debris. Before could process what had happened, two more human ships did the same thing. They targeted cruisers and rammed them at full speed. The humans aboard those ships had known they would die. They had chosen death to take soldiers with them. Admiral Monroe watched from Earth Command as her pilots sacrificed themselves. Each loss hurt, but the strategy was working. They had never faced an enemy willing to trade lives so freely. Their formation began to break apart as captains tried to avoid the suicidal human ships. Colonel Harper had designed this phase of the battle. He called it the Hornet strategy. Small, fast ships would sting the enemy again and again. Each sting might kill the Hornet, but enough stings would bring down even the largest predator. There were hunters who expected prey to run. They did not know how to fight prey that attacked. The space battle raged for 6 hours. They destroyed 29 human ships but lost 8 of their own. By standards, this was a disaster. They had never lost so many vessels in a single engagement. Pulled his fleet back to regroup and tried to understand what had gone wrong. On Earth, the ground invasion had already begun. Landing craft descended on cities across the planet. The aliens expected quick surrender once their soldiers marched through human streets. Instead, they found hell waiting for them. Lieutenant Chris Palmer led a resistance unit in the ruins of a city in Eastern Europe. His squad of 40 fighters faced a patrol of 12 warriors. By every measure, the aliens should have crushed them. They were taller and stronger, and their weapons were more powerful. But Palmer had studied the enemy. He knew their weaknesses. The saw heat signatures. Palmer had his people cover themselves in thermal blankets that masked their body heat. They relied on their armor. Palmer had found that their joints were vulnerable and had trained his fighters to aim for those spots. They fought as individuals seeking personal glory. Palmer's squad fought as a team with each member supporting the others. The ambush happened at midnight in a narrow street between collapsed buildings. Palmer's fighters struck from above and below at the same time. Grenades targeted the alien joints. Rifles fired in coordinated bursts. They roared and fought back with terrible strength. 2 of Palmer's people died in the first seconds. 3 more fell before the battle ended. But when the dust settled, 7 warriors lay dead and the remaining 5 had retreated. Across the planet, similar stories played out. They won most engagements, but every victory cost them soldiers they could not easily replace. The humans lost more fighters, but new volunteers appeared constantly. For every human who fell, two more stepped forward to take their place. Commander received reports from his ground commanders and found them impossible to believe. The humans were not breaking. Their morale was not collapsing. If anything, they seemed to fight harder with each passing day. He ordered his officers to bring him a human prisoner. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. The prisoner they brought was a woman named Bait Cole. She was a sergeant who had been captured after her unit was overrun. She had been shot twice and had lost a lot of blood. The medics had kept her alive for questioning. When they dragged her before, she could barely stand. Towered over her and spoke through a translation device. He asked why her people continued to resist when they had no hope of victory. He asked why they threw away their lives for a battle they could not win. He asked what madness drove them to fight against obvious superiors. Bait Cole looked up at the massive alien commander. Blood dripped from her wounds onto the metal floor. Her legs shook from exhaustion, but her eyes held no fear. She said that humans had been fighting impossible battles since the beginning of their history. She said that they had survived ice and fire and plagues and wars against each other. She said that some things were worth dying for, and freedom was one of them. Then she spat at his feet and said that they had made the worst mistake of their lives coming to Earth. She said that her people would never stop fighting. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. She said that they would learn what happened to hunters who chose the wrong prey. Had her taken back to the holding cells. He stood alone on his bridge and looked out at the blue planet below. For 12,000 years, his people had been the apex predators of their region of space. They had never met a species that could challenge them. Now he was facing creatures who seemed to welcome death if it meant hurting their enemies. For the first time in his long life, felt something cold growing in his chest. He did not recognize it at first because he had never experienced it before. Later, he would realize it was the beginning of doubt, the beginning of fear. The humans had drawn first blood, and they were far from finished. The Empire had conquered many worlds, but they had never needed to understand their prey. Understanding was not necessary when you were strong enough to crush any opposition. But the war on Earth was not going as planned, and Commander needed answers. He sent an urgent request to for their best. The Empire sent Dr. Was old even by standards. He had studied hundreds of species across dozens of worlds. He had written the standard texts on prey psychology that all commanders used. When he arrived on the flagship, he spent 3 days reviewing all available data on humans. He watched recordings of battles. He studied captured human technology. He interviewed prisoners and analyzed their broadcasts. On the 4th day, he requested a private meeting with Commander. What he had learned had shaken him deeply. Began by explaining human evolution. The creatures came from a world that wanted to kill them. Their planet had extreme temperatures and deadly predators and diseases that could wipe out entire populations. Most species in similar conditions would have died out or evolved natural weapons. Humans had done neither. Instead, they had become something far more dangerous. Humans were persistent predators. Their ancient ancestors had hunted by chasing prey for days without rest. They would follow an animal until it collapsed from exhaustion and then kill it. Their bodies were designed for endurance rather than speed or strength. They could keep going long after other creatures had given up. But their bodies were not the truly frightening part. Explained that human psychology was unlike anything in the archives. These creatures formed emotional bonds that logic. They would risk their lives for family members. They would die for friends. They would sacrifice themselves for complete strangers if they believed the cause was right. Asked how this was possible. In culture, each warrior fought for personal glory and survival. The idea of dying for another made no sense. Said that humans had a concept they called love. It was an emotional attachment so strong that it could override the basic instinct for self-preservation. Parents would walk into fire to save their children. Soldiers would throw themselves on explosives to protect their comrades. This was not madness. This was their nature. On the surface of Earth, the war continued. Captain Amy Grant led a convoy of civilian refugees through dangerous territory. Her unit was small and her vehicles were old, but she had promised these people she would get them to safety. They had been hunting them for 3 days. The attack came at dawn. Warriors emerged from the tree line with weapons firing. Grant ordered her soldiers to form a defensive line while the civilians ran. She knew they were outnumbered. She knew most of her people would not survive. But the refugees needed time to escape, and she would give them that time. The battle lasted 40 minutes. Grant lost 11 of her 15 soldiers. She herself was wounded twice but kept fighting. When the last civilian vehicle disappeared over the horizon, she finally ordered a retreat. They had won the ground, but the prey had escaped. Colonel Harper received reports of similar actions across the planet. Everywhere the humans were trading lives for time. They were not trying to defeat the in direct combat. They were bleeding them slowly. Every day the aliens controlled less territory than the day before. Every week their casualty numbers grew while human resistance only intensified. Doctor continued his presentation to Commander. He explained that humans had another trait that made them uniquely dangerous. They were tool users of extraordinary creativity. Give a human a problem, and they would find a solution using whatever materials were available. Their history was filled with examples of weaker forces defeating stronger enemies through cleverness and adaptation. They fought the same way they had fought for thousands of years because their methods worked. Humans changed their tactics constantly. They learned from every battle. They studied weaknesses and developed new weapons to exploit them. They were evolving their warfare faster than they could respond. Asked what recommended, the scientist was silent for a long moment before answering. He said that in 12,000 years of conquest, they had never encountered a species like humans. Every other prey species had broken when they realized they could not win. Humans did not seem to understand this concept. They would fight to the last individual if necessary. Said that they had two choices. They could commit their entire military to this war and accept massive casualties to achieve victory, or they could withdraw and leave these dangerous creatures alone. Rejected both options. Retreat was unthinkable. They were the apex predators of the galaxy. They did not run from prey, but he also could not sacrifice his entire fleet for a single world. He needed a third option. He ordered the destruction of a small coastal town as a demonstration of power. If the humans would not submit to logic, perhaps they would submit to terror. His ships bombarded the town until nothing remained but ash and rubble. He broadcast images of the destruction across all human communication networks. The response was not what he expected. Within hours, human recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers. Production of weapons increased dramatically. Resistance cells that had been hiding emerged to attack positions. Instead of breaking human morale, the destruction had unified them further. Doctor watched the data and shook his head. He told that this was exactly what he had warned about. Humans did not respond to fear the way other species did. Threatening them only made them angry. Hurting them only made them determined. They were not prey at all. They were predators who had simply been waiting for a worthy enemy. 6 months had passed since the invasion began. Commander stood on his bridge and studied the tactical displays with growing unease. The maps showed control zones in red and human territory in blue. When the invasion started, the red had covered most of the planet. Now the blue was spreading like a disease. The controlled only scattered pockets of territory. Their supply lines were constantly raided by human guerrilla units. Their soldiers were exhausted from fighting an enemy that never rested. Morale among the troops had dropped to levels had never seen. Some warriors were beginning to whisper that this war could not be won. On Earth, the humans were preparing something big. Admiral Monroe had been planning Operation Counterstrike for 3 months. Her engineers had captured ships and studied their technology. They had learned how to penetrate shields and had built new weapons based on alien designs. For the first time, human vessels would face warships on equal footing. Commander Sam led the human fleet. He was a quiet man who spoke rarely but thought deeply. He had studied every recording of space combat and had noticed patterns in their tactics. The aliens fought as individuals. Each captain sought personal glory and made decisions independently. This was a strength when facing weaker enemies, but a weakness against coordinated opposition. The Battle of the Moon began at dawn Earth time, positioned his fleet in a formation that appeared weak and disorganized. They took the bait. They charged forward expecting easy kills. When they committed to the attack, sprung his trap. Human ships hidden behind the moon emerged and closed in from behind. Other vessels that had seemed to be retreating suddenly reversed course. They found themselves surrounded on all sides. Their individual tactics became a liability as captains gave conflicting orders and blocked each other's firing solutions. Commanded his fleet with precise coordination. Each ship knew its role and executed it perfectly. When a cruiser tried to break through the human line, 3 vessels moved to intercept it. When the aliens concentrated their fire on one target, other human ships attacked their exposed flanks. They had never faced an enemy that fought like a single organism. The battle lasted 8 hours. When it ended, 14 warships had been destroyed or disabled. Human losses were heavy, but their fleet remained functional. For the first time in the war, the aliens had been defeated in a major space engagement. On the ground, Colonel Harper launched the liberation of Paris. They had held the city for 4 months and had established a major command center there. Harper's forces were outnumbered, but they had something the aliens could not match: the civilian population. When the attack began, the people of Paris rose up alongside the soldiers. Shopkeepers and teachers and factory workers grabbed whatever weapons they could find and joined the fight. Old men who remembered stories of resistance from generations past showed young fighters how to move through the city streets. Women who had been hiding refugees now guided soldiers through secret passages. The commander in Paris could not understand what was happening. His warriors were facing enemies everywhere. For every soldier they killed, 2 civilians appeared to take their place. The humans were not fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting for their home. The battle lasted 3 days. When it ended, the garrison had been completely destroyed. Not a single alien warrior remained alive in the city. Harper stood in the ruins of the command center and watched the sun rise over the liberated streets. Similar victories followed across the planet. Tokyo was liberated, then London, then Sydney. They were pushed back to their landing zones and then pushed back further. Their warriors fought bravely, but they were facing an enemy that simply refused to stop. Commander sent urgent messages to the requesting reinforcements. The response crushed what remained of his hope. The Empire would not send more ships. The war was consuming too many resources. Other subject species were watching, and some were beginning to question authority. The leaders at home had decided that Earth was not worth the cost. Was on his own. He called a meeting of his remaining commanders. Their fleet had been reduced to 12 functional warships. Their ground forces controlled only a handful of positions. Every day brought new losses while the humans grew stronger. The tactical reality was clear even if no one wanted to speak it aloud. Doctor was the first to break the silence. He said that he had warned them about underestimating humans. He said that these creatures had survived extinction events that would have destroyed most species. They had fought wars among themselves that killed hundreds of millions. They were not soft prey. They were hardened survivors who had finally found an external enemy to unite against. Listened in silence. His entire life had been built on the certainty of superiority. His people had dominated the galaxy for thousands of years. The idea that they could be defeated by soft pink creatures from a small blue world was impossible to accept. But the evidence was undeniable. They had come to Earth as conquerors. They had expected another easy victory. Instead, they had awakened something terrible. Gave the order to consolidate all remaining forces for a final offensive. If they were going to fall, they would fall fighting. That was the only option left. The final battle came on a cold morning when frost covered the ground and clouds hid the sun. Commander had gathered his remaining fleet in orbit above Earth for one last offensive. 12 warships against the combined human forces. The aliens knew they could not win, but they refused to surrender. They had never surrendered in their entire history and would not be the first commander to break that tradition. Admiral Monroe watched the enemy formation from Earth Command. She had prepared for this moment for weeks. Her fleet was positioned in a defensive pattern that looked vulnerable from certain angles. Commander waited with the main force while hidden squadrons lurked behind the moon. The trap was set. Ordered the attack. His ships moved forward in a tight formation with weapons charged and shields at maximum. The alien commander knew this was likely his final battle. He intended to make it costly for the humans. If he was going to die, he would take as many of them with him as possible. The first volley of fire lit up the darkness of space. Human ships scattered in apparent disarray. Captains pushed forward sensing victory. They had been losing for so long that the sight of fleeing enemies felt like salvation. They broke formation to chase the retreating vessels. That was their mistake. Gave the signal and the hidden squadrons emerged from behind the moon. They suddenly found themselves surrounded. Human ships closed in from every direction. The aliens who had been hunters moments before were now the hunted. The battle was brutal and short. Warriors fought with desperate courage. They destroyed 5 human vessels before the end, but they could not overcome the coordinated assault. One by one, the alien ships were disabled or destroyed. Fires burned in the vacuum of space as metal twisted and broke apart. Watched from his flagship as his fleet died around him. When only 3 ships remained, something unprecedented happened. 2 of the captains sent messages of surrender. They lowered their shields and stopped firing. For the first time in 12,000 years, warriors had given up. Refused to follow them. He ordered his flagship to charge directly at the human command vessel. If he could kill Admiral Monroe, perhaps his death would mean something. His ship accelerated toward the enemy as human weapons tore into its hull. The flagship was crippled before it reached its target. Survived the crash landing when the burning vessel plunged through the atmosphere and struck the ground in Eastern Europe. He pulled himself from the wreckage with his armor cracked and his body bleeding. He was the last commander standing on Earth. Colonel Harper arrived with a squad of soldiers an hour later. They found waiting outside the ruined ship. The alien was wounded but still dangerous. His claws dripped with venom and his eyes burned with hatred. Harper ordered his soldiers to hold their fire. He stepped forward alone and faced the alien commander. Was twice his size and far stronger even in his injured state. But Harper did not show fear. He simply waited. Spoke through his damaged translator. He asked why Harper had come alone. He asked if the human wanted to die. Harper said no. He said he had come to offer the alien a choice: surrender and live or fight and die. Laughed. He said that warriors did not surrender. He said that humans might accept defeat but his people never would. Then he charged. The fight was savage and brief. His claws tore through Harper's armor and opened deep wounds in his flesh. The alien's strength was overwhelming. He threw Harper across the ground like a toy. But Harper got up. Blood poured from his injuries, but he rose to his feet and faced the alien again, struck him down a second time. Harper got up again. The alien could not understand what he was seeing. Any other creature would have stayed down. Any other creature would have accepted death. But this human kept rising no matter how many times he fell. They fought for 11 minutes. Harper's weapon had been destroyed in the first seconds. He fought with his hands and a combat knife. He was slower than the alien and weaker, but he was still standing when finally collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss. The commander lay on the ground and looked up at the human who had defeated him. He asked how this was possible. How could such small, weak creatures destroy the greatest hunters in the galaxy? Harper knelt beside him. His own wounds were severe and he could barely stay conscious. He said that humans were never the strongest or the fastest. They survived because they never stopped trying. They won because they refused to accept defeat. Closed his eyes and died. The last commander of the invasion force was gone. The news of victory spread across the planet and then across the stars. Humanity had faced the apex predators of the galaxy and had won. Other species heard the story and began to seek contact with Earth. Some wanted protection from enemies of their own. Others wanted trade and alliance. A few simply wanted to meet the creatures who had ended dominance. Doctor became humanity's first ambassador to the galactic community. She met with representatives from dozens of species in the months that followed. Many asked the same question that had asked: how had humans defeated the? Always gave the same answer. She said that humans had spent their entire history fighting to survive. They had faced ice ages and plagues and monsters and wars against each other. They had been prey to 1,000 dangers, but they had never stopped fighting. They had never given up. They had looked at humans and seen soft bodies and weak muscles. They had seen prey, but they had missed what made humans truly dangerous: the determination that burned in every human heart, the refusal to surrender even when victory seemed impossible. Humanity was not the apex predator because of size or strength or natural weapons. Humanity was the apex predator because no matter how many times they were knocked down, they always got back up. The galaxy had learned this lesson. They had learned it too late. And anyone who forgot it would learn it again.